Is masculinity toxic? No. Straight out of the gate, I want to address the term toxic masculinity. The TLDR summary is this: masculinity is not toxic. Masculinity and men have a productive role to play in society. But then why has this term proliferated? Why have I used it in the past? I would argue that toxic masculinity is talking about a real phenomenon. It's a collection of outdated and unhealthy behaviors and practices that are associated with masculinity. But it's not masculinity in itself. And for that reason, instead of toxic masculinity, I like the term impossible masculinity, because these unhealthy masculine traits become impossible to live up to and maintain our physical, emotional, spiritual health, not to mention the physical, emotional, spiritual health of those whom we're in relationship with. After completing my master's in public health at Emory University, I did a one-year fellowship at University of North Carolina. I was exploring whether or not I wanted to get a PhD in public health. Spoiler, I didn't. Some of my friends tell me this makes me a school dropout, but at least I was dropping out around the 22nd grade, so there's that. But up to this point, I'd spent my career on studies and interventions focused on health issues of populations I didn't belong to. Groups such as African Americans, Latinos, Africans, women, children, migrant workers, and I was looking at conditions like HIV/AIDS, cancer, toxin exposure, birth defects. My interest had been in helping others who were less fortunate than myself. This tied in with my own idea of masculinity, which is one that cares for and protects others. That's a good thing. But also, as we so often find, there was another side to it. It felt a bit awkward for me to presume to intervene on something as intimate and personal as the health of others without turning the lens on myself and my own demographic. Plus, I was worried that if I didn't know what it was like to have my own behaviors put under the microscope, at best, I would not be able to relate to the communities I was working with. And at worst, I was running the risk of being a hypocrite. So, for the time of my fellowship, I decided to focus any research opportunity on the demographic I belong to: young adult males. My research questions were simple. What were the primary health issues for men in their late teens, 20s, and early 30s in the US? What I found shocked me. The leading cause of morbidity and mortality for men in my age group was injury. This could be related to work or sports, manual labor, extreme sports, drugs, alcohol, violence, and all these things increased the likelihood of injury. The thread that ran through it all was risky behavior. And a hard truth came into focus. In every other population I studied, environmental or social risk factors that patients had marginal control over were the most significant contributors to poor health. Young men, on the other hand, we were healthy. We were doing this to ourselves. This is how I came to understand toxic masculinity. Well, that's been a lie. I've been living toxic masculinity for my whole life. The data just let me see it. Even aside from infectious agents, environmental exposures, disease vectors, my public health training tells me that there are always social determinants of health. The truth is that disease affects different populations differently. But diseases don't care about national borders, skin color, gender, or economic status. But we do. So our behavior, as affected by those social structures, impacts who gets sick or hurt. I was doing this research in the early 2000s. Shockingly, the data has only gotten worse since then. Men, young men and boys, have higher rates of mental illness, suicide, drug addiction, lower levels of school achievement, and decreased earning potential. They are more isolated and have fewer friends. Now, there are some members of the progressive left who are going to say, patriarchy has ensured that the whole world has been made for men. Racism has ensured that the whole world has served the needs of white men. Especially if they're suffering now, white men that is, or men in general, that's A, a long overdue comeuppance, and B, it's a proper historical correction. Those attitudes are not attitudes of compassion, inclusion, tolerance, and acceptance. Presumably, the virtues liberalism prides itself on. I'm here to say that the state of men and boys, the state that they find themselves in now, is not that, for many reasons. Justice and equity do not take the form of revenge and retribution. This is not justice and equity. This is not, it's your turn to suffer, even though some liberals are saying that. We don't respond to oppression with more oppression. We don't respond to injustice with hardened hearts and inhumanity. Some folks are led to these conclusions because they only judge men by their worst examples, by their worst days. This is a spirit of sanctimony that has curdled the debate on so many social justice issues, and it's led to backlash against cancel culture and perceived wokeism. Listen, we can't cancel half the population. And such an attitude towards any group runs the risk of ignoring their humanity, which is something else that the progressive left usually prides itself on. I've been on the wrong side of this debate in the past, and I've alienated men because of it. So we have to break free of the either-or framework because it's one based on scarcity. It assumes addressing the injustice of patriarchy and the obstacles that women face means punishing men or leaving them to flounder. And let's be honest, when things are this bad for men, when we can't find a purpose in life, constructive ways to contribute to our families, to our relationships, to the communities we live in, all of society suffers. We are all in this together. But aside from external changes in employment opportunities, economic outlooks, and the things like the increase of automation that we as individuals don't have a lot of control over, I want to return to the portion of this that we men are doing to ourselves, because that's the piece that we have more control over. See, some of our very behaviors and practices put us at risk. These are behaviors and practices we see modeled and then copy, sometimes unquestioningly. We take them on ourselves without asking ourselves, are these good for me? Are these good for me? Or what bits are bad and what bits are good? What bits are healthy? What bits hurt us? The self-destruction becomes an inside job. And the problem is our model of masculinities. Study after study has shown how rites of passage, the socialization of males, are built around risky behaviors. This includes contact sports, attitudes about manual labor, violence, patterns of eating, drinking, drug taking. Combine that with risky sexual behavior and a limited acceptable range of emotional expression, the ideal of the rugged, independent man, the isolated man, and it all comes together in a toxic soup, a recipe for emotional stunting, physical injuries. Not to mention the way these behaviors and lack of emotional regulation bleed over into domestic violence. This is made all the worse by the proliferation of firearms and gun culture targeted at men in the US. Ryan Boose is the author of Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. Boose is a former executive at a gun manufacturer. After a quarter century working in the industry, he came to the realization that the industry itself, through marketing targeted at young men, marketing that stoked their resentment, their insecurities, it had created a customer that kills people, including themselves. Is it any surprise then for certain ages the leading causes of death for men is by firearm? America certainly has a gun problem. We know mass shootings are committed mostly by men with troubled backgrounds. But if you look at the data, another striking truth emerges. Most victims of gun violence die by their own hand, and the majority of those deaths are men. Stop the presses. I know you might be saying, wait, Ted, that can't be true. I would have heard about this in the news. No, you actually wouldn't. But there's a reason for it. Putting on my public health hat again. Research has demonstrated that publishing news stories about suicides has a contagion effect. The more you publish, the more people commit suicide. The evidence is incontrovertible. And the media purposefully underreports news about suicides. The media is stuck in a bind. If they reported on cases of suicide like they reported on murders, we would have a different understanding of A, what gun violence really looks like in this country, and B, how prevalent issues of mental health are. But if they did that, more people would die. We haven't found a good solution to this. It's a big dilemma. I can speak from my own experience. When my depression was at its worst and I was suicidal, it felt like every story that was published was about suicide, or at least the ones jumped out at me. There weren't that many, but somehow each morning I seemed to find at least one in my newsfeed. There's also the possibility that the algorithms that influenced my media diet had picked up on my depression and my suicidality, and it was putting these stories in front of me because I was interested. And at this time, I was also seeing a lot more ads for antidepressants. Weird, huh? The algorithms know what's going on with us sometimes better than our friends and family. I don't know what to do with that realization. So let's put it on the shelf for now. At the time, I was 34. We were in the wake of the 2008 Great Recession. I had been laid off. I'd experienced a tough breakup, and the economic outlook for the future was bleak. My depressed mind assigned outsized importance to those suicide stories. Each example of one person following through with killing themselves led me to further pursue that route, that escape from my own pain. And my notions of masculinity and my failure to live up to what I thought was a man, or what a man was supposed to have done by that point in my life, have a job, have a house, have a wife, have children whom I provided for, were front and center in my self-hate and my disappointment in myself. So I started making plans. I had 3 different methods I was contemplating for making my big exit. There's a wild number of motivations that lead to suicidal ideation. Part of it is self-hate. Part of it is isolation. Part of it is just you just want the pain to stop. But what my own experience illustrates is this. A major social determinant of injuries to men my age, again, is that concept of what it means to be a man. Let me stress, there is nothing wrong with being a man, except when we take these things to the extreme. Extremes are less than useful. Again, I'll use myself as an example. My chronic back problems, they can be traced to a back injury I suffered as a direct result of masculine performance. This is when I was living in Kenya, working for a nonprofit agency focused on pediatric HIV/AIDS. Some colleagues and I were unloading tanks of kerosene for cooking stoves out of the trunk of a car. Each one weighed 165 pounds. A guy twice my size and weight grabbed the first tank out and carried it away from the car over to the kitchen where it was needed. I was left alone with the second tank. Me and all 5 feet 10 inches and 135 pounds of me. It occurred to me I could ask someone for help, but I didn't. I didn't want to be seen as a wimp. So I grabbed it and I carried it triumphantly to the kitchen. The next day I couldn't walk. I couldn't even get out of bed. I had herniated my L4 disc, and I still live with the consequences of that choice. And I will for the rest of my life. But I was a man, damn it. Yeah, I know, stupid in retrospect. But this experience isn't unique to me. These days, I like to talk about a version of masculinity that works for me. It's a simple formula. Harm no one, care and protect everyone. That's it. It doesn't require impressing anyone. It doesn't require self-sacrifice unless in dire situations. And it does not require self-harm or self-hate. If I had practiced that formula, I would never have hurt myself. I would have cared better for myself in that moment. And I wouldn't have chronic injuries now. Bell Hooks has a timeless quote. The first act of violence that a patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. End quote. She's talking about impossible masculinity. I'd go so far as to say that it's not just figurative violence we do to ourselves, but literal, physical. We can do better. More to come in the following videos. But now, maybe you can understand why, when I sign off, I remind you to be kind to yourself and others. That becomes the cornerstone of a better, healthier masculinity. Thanks.